All right, starting this hour, a look back at the events that led to the siege of an entire city. Just over 2 weeks ago, the city of Boston experienced terror firsthand during one of its most celebrated sporting events. As a manhunt ensued to find those responsible for the attack, law enforcement put the city on lockdown, going door to door using all means necessary to catch the perpetrators. Now, as we all know, that exhaustive search turned out to be successful. And after shutting down the city, the FBI, along with local police officers, that was able to apprehend suspected bomber Johar Tsarnaev alive. But not all are seeing this as a triumph. Former Texas Congressman Ron Paul, along with many civil libertarians, see the events in Boston more as a worry than a win. In a recent op-ed, Paul said, quote, the reason for the military-style takeover of parts of Boston was that the accused perpetrator of a horrific crime was on the loose. The Boston bombing provided the opportunity for the government to turn what should have been a police investigation into a military-style occupation of an entire American city. This unprecedented move should frighten us as much than just an attack itself. So are we indeed trading away our safety for our security? Here to break this down and much more, Governor Gary Johnson joins me now.
Megan, great to be with you.
Thank you
for
so
having me here.
For coming in the studio. It's quite a pleasure to have you here. So let's begin by talking about the Boston bombing.
You know, it just raised a lot of issues with me. The fact that the Boston police handled this the way that they handled it, I think that was their prerogative. But the questions that really arise are due process. Who was looking over the shoulder of the police to determine if, in fact, what they were doing was constitutional? And of course, it is, well, what they're doing was legal, and this is because of the Patriot Act. You know, Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, due process. Who's looking over the shoulders of the police to determine if what has gone on is lawful, meaning constitutional? Well, the Patriot Act throws all that out. So, and then it raises questions about drones, drone surveillance. Those that said, well, gosh, we could have unleashed drones in this situation. Well, no, you can't, because who then looks over the shoulder of the operator of the drone that ultimately may pull the trigger? And then you start talking about militarization of drones, meaning armed drones or surveillance drones. And as long as there's due process, that's the real key here. And apparently that was thrown out the window, and that's because of the Patriot Act. These individuals were not read their rights. They were treated as guilty as opposed to innocent until proven guilty.
And that's one of the things I was going to ask you about, because you're talking about the Constitution, you're talking about due process. There was a big question over the Miranda rights and whether they should have been read to somebody that is a potential terror suspect.
And then you can't help but equate, or when you start focusing on how we may have used drones in this situation, and the outcry over, well, no, you really can't use drones because there may have been innocent people killed. Why can't we make the connection with what we're doing overseas with drones and the fact that we're killing innocent people overseas? And that's one of the reasons why the United States is so vilified for its military interventions.
Well, let's talk about drones for a second. You have up-and-coming libertarian Rand Paul, who on one hand is holding these epic filibuster to actually get more information about drone surveillance. And on the other hand, you have him going on to Fox Business News and saying that it doesn't matter to him if a person shoots somebody in a convenience store and we use a drone to take that person out. So talk about this juxtaposition between his libertarian views and yours.
Well, having a drone for surveillance, when there is due process, when there's a judge that says, yes, very quickly, yes, we need to send a drone into a situation like this for surveillance. But if you're going to arm a drone in a situation like that, Megan, I think you're going to have unintended consequence, and that unintended consequence is it's not a trained military sniper out of a helicopter. It's somebody operating this remote control, and they're going to pull a trigger, remote control. control. Somebody that's innocent is going to end up hurt or killed in this situation. And now I'm back to this, why can't we make that connection? We're outraged over what I just said. Why can't we make that connection with what's happening overseas when it isn't a bullet that's being fired, it's a bomb that's being dropped? And no, we don't kill the intent. We don't just kill the intended target. We kill dozens, if not hundreds, of other innocent people in a given situation.
And Gary, what you're saying is echoed so many times in other libertarian points of views when they're talking about foreign policy. So let's talk about foreign policy right now. Today, President Obama spoke with White House reporters, and he said that the crisis in Syria is growing. He acknowledged the fact that chemical weapons might be being used in Syria, but he doesn't know by who. So let's take a listen to what President Obama said, and then we'll talk about it.
What we now have is evidence that chemical weapons have been used inside of Syria, but we don't know how they were used, when they were used, who used them. We don't have a chain of custody that establishes what exactly happened. And when I am making decisions about America's national security and the potential for taking additional action in response to chemical weapon use, I've got to make sure I've got the facts.
He wants to make sure he has the facts. Now, this is something that a lot of people would argue President Bush didn't do before entering Iraq with the weapons of mass destruction. Is it fair to compare Syria with Iraq, the weapons of mass destruction with the alleged chemical use?
I think it is. Let's get all the information. And after we've gotten all the information, let's look at our military interventions in the past. I suggest to you that there is not a military intervention in my life that has been warranted and hasn't resulted in consequences that were unpredictable from the start. Our military interventions have resulted in hundreds of millions of enemies to this country that, but for our military interventions, I don't think would otherwise exist.
So you're talking non-interventionism. Does it ever come to a point, because right now what we know in Syria is that at least 70,000 people have died in this civil conflict. Does there ever come a point in your mind where we need to say, okay, it's time for the U.S. or another international body to step in and help those people?
It's, you know, when you talk about it just like you've talked about it, who cannot say, gosh, this is something that we need to consider? But the reality is that when you look at our past actions, when you look at our past interventions, you said 70,000 people have been killed. When you look at our past military interventions, our military interventions result in another 100,000 losing their lives. But somehow that's justified because it's on the side of good. It's on the side of the United States. And I'm being facetious. I'm being facetious. Our military interventions don't end up improving these situations.
And obviously that was the case because we did back the rebels that became Al-Qaeda back in the 1980s and 90s.
Didn't we learn anything when it came to Afghanistan?
So let's talk about the history that the U.S. has. So let's talk about Saddam Hussein. Let's talk about Iraq, okay? Now, when it comes to Iraq, we prosecuted Saddam, well, the international body actually prosecuted Saddam Hussein. He was killed for killing 148 people using chemical weapons, right? But in 2005 in Fallujah, didn't we do the same thing with white phosphorus?
Well, I'm not familiar with that particular situation that you're talking about, but it is hypocrisy. It's absolute hypocrisy. The fact that our military interventions are okay, that the foreign despot that we're now promoting, taking over from the foreign despot that we didn't like, ends up being somebody we don't like in the future. And I'm talking about Mubarak. You know, Mubarak. We back Mubarak, but we now openly admit that yes, he was very corrupt, and this was a horrible situation. But that he was better than what would have been. We're making these determinations. We should not be making these determinations.
And Gary, it's because of the fact that the reason I was bringing up the Fallujah incident is because some of the upper officials of the Bush administration are now saying that yes, war crimes were committed. Do you think that they should be punished, or do you think they will be punished even?
Well, they should be punished. War crimes should be punished. No one is immune from liability of breaking the law.
What about the Bush administration?
Well, in this case, if the law was broken, there should not be immunity from that kind of prosecution, ever.
So let's talk about Guantanamo Bay. Obviously, you're against Guantanamo Bay. We know now that there's a hunger strike going on.
Well, what I'm against, Megan, is arrest and detainment without being charged. I also recognize that Guantanamo Bay as a facility may be a facility that we need, meaning housing enemy combatants that there is no place for. Arrest and detainment without charge, that practice has to stop. Guantanamo Bay as a facility may be a facility that we need. I wish President Obama were a lot more transparent on why he didn't shut down Guantanamo. Well, I have a sense that, gosh, this is a facility that if we shut it down, we're just going to have to duplicate it somewhere else. Arrest and detainment, torture, stop, stop.
So what would President Johnson have done when it comes to Guantanamo Bay?
I would have shut down the practice for which we think Guantanamo Bay should be shut down for, which is arrest and detainment without being charged and torture. That is not something that we should be any part of. That's what we fought wars over.
Gary Johnson, thank you so much for joining us. 2012 presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party, Gary Johnson.
Megan, thank you.
Thank you.